In this Q&A video, we cover vaccines and poverty, population, climate, transgender sports, and a bunch more besides. So let's get straight to it. Why are people being given Pfizer booster jabs when their first 2 doses were AstraZeneca? The vaccines work in completely different ways, ? This is UK specific question, obviously. I think the answer is twofold. One, there have been several studies that showed that a mix of vaccines provides stronger protection than just the one. And second, the Pfizer vaccine has generally been slightly better performance than the AstraZeneca. So since we're no longer in the territory of just getting it out as quickly as possible from a standing start, I guess the government went for the one with the likelihood of the best result. As for do they work in completely different ways? Well, yes and no. They work in exactly the same way in the one most important sense, which is what they do is to train your body's antibodies to recognise SARS-CoV-2 when they see it and to be poised to attack it. But the mechanism they use in order to trigger that is the part that's different. Now, I'm not going to pretend to have such a detailed grasp of virology as to be able to explain without specific research why the combination of the two approaches ends up with a stronger result. As humans, our bare minimum requirements for food and shelter are equal. Given this, why is poverty a relative term? As an aside, my wife was brought up in South America, and the use of the term poverty in the UK goes against the grain. You guys have no idea what poverty is, she tells me. And she is completely correct. The issue here is that we measure and give headlines to what is called relative poverty, which is one of those measures that makes no sense within the context which it's often used for. Because I, along with your wife clearly, would expect poverty to be a measure of actual genuine hardship. And we do kind of measure that in reference to the absence of certain basic staples rather than as a set income level. So I can tell you, courtesy of the Child Poverty Action Group, that 100,000 children lack 3 meals a day or a warm winter coat. Now, how robust that figure is, I would be inclined to check if I was doing a video on the topic, but it is at least a reasonable measure of something we might recognise as deprivation. Generally, though, we report this relative poverty thing, and on that basis, the poverty line is considered to be 60% of median income. On that measure, 14 million people live below the poverty line. Now, that is a conceptually stupid way to measure poverty, it seems to me, because it measures how far away people are from the average. Well, in a wealthy society, that means you might fall under that line and still be nowhere near what we would recognise as material deprivation. And not only that, because it's a self-referential measure, however wealthy your society gets, you will never abolish poverty by definition. If every person in the country was at least a millionaire, you will still have about the same number of people with less than 60% of median income. It's good for poverty campaign groups, I guess, who can throw around statistics about the 14 million people who live in poverty and therefore need their help. But the rest of us have no way of knowing what that figure actually represents in terms of actual deprivation. Like the gender pay gap, it's a measure that makes you wonder at the obvious stupidity of institutions. Somehow, sometime, the human race will either find a way to create a stable and sustainable population on the earth, or it will die out. Infinite growth is not possible in any circumstances anywhere. Looking honestly at the overall changes needed to human consumption, behaviour and attitudes, when should we start thinking about this problem? And what should be the first thing we do? Human population growth is kind of taking care of itself, with a major slowdown in rates of growth currently underway in the developed world and also in China. And according to projections, by the end of the century, the population will be levelling off at around 11 billion people. Various economists who project a future of continuing economic growth to follow the same pattern as the recent past are kind of failing to account for this completely different structure to our society. We can still innovate our way to increasing prosperity, so long as we don't mess up the systems in the meantime, which is a big if, obviously. But the rapid growth society of the recent past was fueled by an astonishing rapid growth in population, as well as innovation. The question comes down to how much you can decouple material well-being and life chances from material consumption. Because eventually you get to the steady state system where you don't use resources faster than they can be replaced, you don't create waste faster than they can be absorbed and processed. I mean, eventually it may be 100 years before you finally hit that point, but eventually it has to be the underpinning for the economy by definition. There's plenty of evidence with ongoing innovation we can continue to increase well-being and reduce poverty while using resources more and more efficiently. It doesn't mean we'll get there smoothly. There will be events, localized disasters, certain materials or processes that collapse to the detriment of what we can do in the short term, and things that we can't quite anticipate, I'm sure. And those will probably be necessary because we innovate what we need when the signals in front of us are clear. We will become astonishingly good at reclaiming and reusing all sorts of materials when we find we don't have a choice. We won't do what you suggest, I'm sorry to say, to look wisely ahead and anticipate all the problems and take far-reaching action in exactly the right way. I mean, obviously we should try, and the early efforts may give us something to build on when we have to do it for real. If we ever get to a world where governments pursue policies to constrain population growth specifically, that will be just horrible. Because we are not capable of crafting policies to do that don't end up in a dystopia with all sorts of unintended consequences, as we've already seen. What are your views on the UK HSA's vaccine surveillance reports, which show higher and increasing rates of infection among the vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated? Is this evidence of original antigenic sin, as anti-vax Substack bloggers Igor Chudov and Eugipius have speculated? Okay, I'm not familiar with those bloggers, and I've not researched the specific phenomenon that you're highlighting here. But generally, these things are statistical outcomes that make perfect sense when they're seen in context. So, for instance, if a system measures the status of people that become hospitalised, by dint of the fact that it's selecting people who ended up in hospital, and therefore all the people who got breakthrough cases that were mild and not included in the sample by definition, you can end up with results that can be misunderstood or indeed misrepresented. Likewise, any system that involves self-reporting by people, you get a big upsurge when there's a time of heightened public awareness than you would do at any other time. But again, that can be misunderstood or misrepresented. So without looking in detail about the specific claims that those people are making, I haven't yet seen arguments relating to those reporting systems that don't come down to one or both of those factors. But, if you've got something specific that you think is more solidly based than that, by all means, give me the details in the comments below. Do you think the BBC's environmental coverage is independent, fact-focused and non-ideological? Well, I've done a couple of videos criticising some of their coverage, so no, not in its entirety. It's like all things with the mainstream media. 90% of what they report is basically good quality, basically true, will give you one level of information that helps you to understand the world around you. The remaining 10% or 5% or 7% or whatever it is tends to centre on the politically divisive issues where the journalists have strong ideological preferences and beliefs and a sense that it's their job to further a narrative to ensure a real world positive outcome in their eyes. The problem is that you don't always know which issues are which, and though it may just be 5% of the output, it can be the most important 5%, precisely because it's about the issues that are shaping current events in a major way. So a lot of the BBC's environmental coverage is fine, some of their climate coverage is fine, the rest goes well over the line into nudging and influencing and outright campaigning. And that has the result that lots of people end up not really trusting anything that they see at all, which is the corrosive unintended consequence when institutions betray public trust on a regular basis. As someone who pays for the YouTube service to avoid adverts, I get increasingly annoyed content creators promoting third-party goods and services in their videos. Can you tell us exactly how much money YouTube pays you week on week? Well, the bulk of money paid by YouTube comes through adverts, which entirely depends on how much your videos are being viewed. So before YouTube tweaked the algorithm, I had several months where I was getting about £500-600 from advertising. Since the beginning of March this year, that dropped to just over 100, just about every month, I think. Here's a screenshot for the current situation. The analytics for the last 28 days, nearly 40,000 views, just under £120. And that's slightly down because I skipped 2 videos last week, but you get the idea. Alternatively, break it down by video. So a recent video that performed to the top end of the rather low ceiling I'm bumping up against, Our Leaders Are Idiots, got nearly 4k views, brought in a grand total of £11.84. You can see it says more regular viewers watched it. And that's the best that I get these days because it doesn't show the videos much to non-subscribers. So I get the ones that do well get more regular viewers watching it. If we go back to before early March, before YouTube's algorithm tweak, say this one, the one I did on the Great Reset, tons of non-subscriber views, 62k, over 500 new subscribers, for that video about £150. The creators you're talking about get much more than that because you don't get the brand sponsorship deals unless you have the audience. So they're probably getting several thousand per month from advertising, plus whatever their brand deal is getting them on top of that. That said, bear in mind that not all audiences get monetized at the same rate. It depends on the behaviors of your group. So my videos appeal mostly to older males, a high value demographic for advertising by and large. Something like a gaming channel might need to get more views for the same income if they mostly get, younger people who don't spend very much. Look, I sympathise. I personally don't mind brief endorsement messages, but I'm seeing more and more videos that were ostensibly about a topic that turn into effectively a video-long promotion for something. I turn off mid-roll ads for my own videos because I want the focus to be on the content, even if that means not optimizing for the most cash. Which, of course, is why when I say every week that I couldn't do this without my Patreon supporters, that is exactly what I mean. Is slowing climate warming the most important imperative we are facing? What is wrong with a cost-benefit approach that would rank the world's problems, such as put forward by Bjorn Lomborg and others? I am worried that the world's leaders are taking us on a path that will cost trillions each year for decades without any discernible improvement for 50 or more years. Okay, there's 2 parts to that question. 1, is slowing global warming a short-term imperative? And 2, should we be worried about expensive, ineffective policies that may be pursued by the world's leaders? And those are 2 different points, so let's do them one at a time. Yes, climate change is an important short-term imperative. Your question asked, is it the most important? Well, we could discuss that, but it kind of doesn't matter. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So dealing with the challenges of China, dealing with reducing poverty, with recovery from COVID disruption, and dealing with climate change. These are all on our to-do list. And if we can only focus on one at a time, we are screwed. But of course, that isn't the case. We can multitask as societies. As I said in my video on Lomborg, he has some good points in principle that he rather spoils by cherry-picking figures to exaggerate the force of his arguments. Cost-benefit analysis is great, but you have to be able to trust the figures, some of which will necessarily be based on some degree of speculation in this situation. But if we ignore his figures and just look at the principles, then yes, we should be caring about effectiveness and value for money. And then secondly, yes, the leaders of the world are largely bumbling fools who come up with policies for reactive, insular, ideological or blinkered reasons until reality forces them into a course correction, which it usually eventually does. Decarbonising the world's power makes sense. Doing it by placing a high emphasis on wind power in a part of the world where we expect climate change to reduce wind speeds, that seems, shall we say, counterintuitive. Dismantling nuclear power stations before the end of their life and refusing to even engage with the possibility of new nuclear, even 4th generation nuclear that doesn't have so many of the downsides. Not what you would think makes sense. The point is, we need political opposition that is focused on making such a transition better and more intelligently. Unfortunately, in the UK, we have an opposition that has no ideas about what would make it better. They just think it should be done even faster. Or you've got certain non-party actors who would like the whole process to stop. Neither of those are quite as helpful as we need. Ironically, the ones who want it to stop will at least provide some robust political opposition that will force governments to up their game. In the last election in Australia, Scott Morrison presented a position on climate change which was different to what Boris Johnson and Prince Charles present, and he won the election. I think it was one of the key reasons why he won the election. So by them criticising Scott Morrison, they are really criticising the Australian people. This is not just a Scott Morrison issue, it is a position held by us. I'm not quite clear which criticism you're referring to, because from the bits I'd seen, I thought they were relatively diplomatic and restrained. But assuming I've missed a bunch of stuff, which is entirely possible, and it went further, in principle, I think people should be able to say what they think. If the answer to those opinions includes pointing out that the voters expressed a contrary view in the last election, that's a perfectly valid thing to argue. But equally, you're generally on a sticky wicket when you hold an election that covers lots of different issues, and then you decide that the winning candidate has received a specific and explicit endorsement for every single part of their policy platform. The politicians themselves know it's not that simple. Polling suggested that the management of the economy was seen as the biggest issue in the election, along with health and Medicare. You could argue that just because Morrison was seen as more sound on those key issues than his opponents, that didn't necessarily mean that the majority of the electorate thought there should be no progress made on climate change. If you go on polling that focuses specifically on the issue, the Lowy Institute poll suggests that a majority of Australians view climate change as a critical threat to Australia's vital interests, which is presumably one factor in Morrison's recent efforts to at least commit to a net zero target, even if we don't entirely see how he thinks it's going to happen. If that was locally seen as a grievous betrayal of his election promises, presumably there would have been protests in the streets by now. Alternatively, you could say that Prince Charles and Boris Johnson are at least in line with what the polls say that the Australian public actually think. So, these things are never quite as straightforward as that. In any case, no government can freeze its attitude to issues of practical global concern to whatever it was saying on the day of an election. It's inevitably a part of the give and take of global geopolitics. You elect people that you trust to make decisions in an environment of changing circumstances. If elections were to stick rigidly to manifesto provisions with no variation, and you basically have governance once every 4 or 5 years by referendum, which would not be a great system. Courts in the US ruled that politicians are not allowed to block social media followers for an expression of political views. Doing so denies citizens access to public forums. Social media sites routinely ban users over expressed political views, thus resulting in the same effect. Would you support governments forbidding their officials, ministries, departments, schools, etc. from using corporate social media sites as public forums to avoid this situation? So basically this goes to the heart of the dilemma around a de facto public square being operated under the sole control of a giant tech corporation. I think there's a variety of ways you could address this, but banning public officials from using the platform full stop is probably the one that runs the risk of less oversight and engagement with the political process overall, which I doubt is what we want. A compromise proposal would be that in order to qualify for having such public accounts, a social media provider has to sign up to a charter of best practice that would define the very limited circumstances where you can ban someone from your platform for a political expression. Because, if someone directly urges physical violence, then I think most people would say that person should be able to be banned, which means there is a line. But if there's no oversight or governance on where that line is drawn, I think governments could draw up cross-party agreed standards and insist on those as the requirement for that provider to be able to operate as part of the public square in that way. And then no one's forcing that on them. If they don't choose to meet those standards, that's fine, they can do that. They just then don't get those official accounts. If they do, then they become a part of a lightly regulated public space. I'm sure there are more complications and objections to that I haven't considered, but it seems like a reasonable starting point to me. It's sort of an evolution of what you suggested. The jailing of some Insulate Britain activists was loudly cheered by some, but I am less convinced that it is the best outcome. In a recent video, Roger Hallam stated that one purpose of having people jailed is to have them acting as recruiting sergeants upon release. They would be wheeled out at activist meetings to tell romanticised tales of bravery in the face of oppression to sway the gullible into further silliness. I would favour financial penalties for those with assets, or very time-consuming community service for those without. Would you agree? Well, it's tricky, because if activists take the intent to go to prison, then they can make it so that you have little choice but to send them there. You know, if you fine them, they refuse to pay the fine. If you sentence them to community service, they refuse to turn up and do the service. And then ultimately, the only remaining sanction that can be imposed upon a non-cooperating individual is detention. But Hallam's not wholly rational in his estimation of the added power this gives to recruitment anyway. In the peace movement in the 1980s, plenty of us went to prison for various protests. I think those people were often admired by their equally committed peers. I don't think it had a noticeable recruitment effect. What in Roger's mind is heroic can come across as extreme and alarming to people who are in the mainstream. Does ESG investing, that's ESG, environmental, social and governance, actually do anything, or is it just asset managers trying to make more money from idealistic investors? Note the comments from BlackRock's ex-head of ESG, who trashed the whole concept as a cynical exercise. Is he right? That's not exactly what he did, to be fair. So the principle from an investment point of view goes on two tracks. One is a straight customer choice thing. There are plenty of investors now who want to make money, but they don't want to make it from business processes that they think are detrimental to the health of the societies in which they live. You can debate with them which processes those are, but that seems a reasonable proposition, actually, and there is a lot of money in it. People can spend their money how they want, and if they're prepared to pay a small premium for that, then everybody's relatively happy. Then the question arises, though, whether the products actually deliver on that element as they promise. How companies are rated in that regard can be very controversial. What the ex-head of ESG for BlackRock did slate was so-called green bonds that companies sell on the basis that they will fund good projects. The criteria for judgment of the effectiveness of that, highly questionable. They merit some serious challenge and scrutiny. The other investment argument is that companies that have good environmental, social and governance attributes tend to be lower risk and therefore better investments. Less at risk of major pollution incidents, less at risk of corrupt management, and so on and so on. And there's quite a lot to that. But again, it comes to the skill of the ESG investment firms in how they identify which companies genuinely qualify, because it can be hard to spot from the outside. So Enron, for instance, had good environmental and social programs. It was just deeply corrupt at the top of the organisation, which eventually brought it crashing down in the end. But nobody could see that coming. I don't think the facts justify blanket cynicism, but the premium rates for ESG products will inevitably attract some lower quality operators to cash in as much as they do the higher quality ones. And it means any investor has to apply some degree of intelligence in how they invest. There's no magic formulas. But we surely knew that. Based on the current concerns over freedom of speech and civil liberties, the woke agenda and seemingly unfettered immigration, along with China's rise of power and influence, is the ultimate fall of the West and democracy inevitable? Short answer's no. Inevitable is a big word. For all their failings, capitalism and democracy have endured this long because of their inherent capability to adapt and to course correct. And we have had a number of times when the future seemed dark and uncertain, and various people were predicting the inevitability of collapse or revolution or whatever it was. We will endure as long as we can face such moments of uncertainty with a degree of courage and conviction in our identity and the values that make the fight worthwhile. I think we still have that. We're never entirely sure until we're looking backwards at the moment, having passed it into history. We may see some relative decline without collapse, of course, and don't presume that China has no fault lines built into its own society, because it has plenty. The future isn't written yet, which means everything's still to play for. The IOC recently changed its advice on transgender athlete eligibility from being testosterone-based to being based on competitive advantage. Does this change adequately address the fairness concerns a lot of people have with women competing against trans women? Are the IOC simply fobbing off the problem to the individual sports because it's impossible to come up with a rule that is both fair and inclusive? As an alternative solution, what are your thoughts on replacing men's competition with an open grade competition that anyone can compete in, male, female, intersex, trans, as long as it's safe, paired with having a strictly biological, female-only women's competition? I think the confusion in this area reflects the fact that it's hard to generalise, in spite of the fact that we'd all like one simple cross-the-board rule that would elegantly provide fairness and inclusion in one fell swoop. In some sports, there is a clear advantage for anyone who went through puberty as a man, weightlifting being an obvious example. But there are some other sports, endurance-based sports, where the advantage is a lot less clear-cut. So I can understand how the IOC ends up where it is. I'm personally attracted to the idea of the open competition, along with a protected women's competition as being the default, with certain sports then able to qualify for an alternative approach based on good, solid medical evidence, as opposed to the shouting of activists. Ultimately, when you get a perception of unfairness because of how someone looks in contrast to the rest of the field, it's creating an intolerable sense of injustice that is going to eventually force a change and will make any awards won by those individuals seeming tainted and of lesser value. It's in everyone's interest to get to a solution that doesn't sit there as a running sore, attracting negative attention and criticism for something that seems intuitively and obviously wrong. Being from Sweden, I was not prepared for your remark about universities trying to protect students from the perils of sex work. If it is, as some say, that the sex work is done in order to pay for tuition and subsistence at the university, doesn't this make the university a brothel? An institution taking advantage of someone selling their body? I mean, obviously that has been the criticism. I mean, that made the news precisely because to so many of us it seemed like an incredibly foolish thing to do. I mean, for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't make the university a brothel. It does put it in the position of normalising damaging behaviour. In the name of making it slightly less damaging, it would probably be more sensible to discourage it full stop. All right. I had a few others that I will take as requests for future videos, including topics such as deep ocean carbon sequestering, molten salt reactors, and whether spike protein impairs DNA repair. And I got one final question about the studio makeover from Green Screen. How long did you spend decorating? It was longer in the planning, working out what sort of background would work best for what I do. Once I got there, it was a couple of days, moving around, painting, getting in the right lighting and all of that sort of thing. It's just notable how hard it is to do any of that and absorb it into the schedule of doing 3 videos per week of the sort that I do here. All right. Thanks to all of you for your questions. Apologies to anyone that I missed. See you all for the Friday News Roundup. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.